July 12, 1917, a baseball park in Arizona. 2,000 men in the dirt behind a machine gun on a car. No trial, no warrants, no charges. The men holding the rifles are not soldiers, not federal marshals, not the sheriff. They work for a copper company. That company wrote the list of names, chose who got dragged from bed at dawn, chose who got loaded into cattle cars, dumped in New Mexico, then locked the empty town behind them, issued their own passports, ran secret courts for 4 months. The Supreme Court said none of it was a crime. That copper company was Phelps Dodge. In 1917, it was one of the largest corporations in the United States, and to understand what it did in a small town called Bisbee, you have to understand what America was actually fighting World War I with. Not just soldiers, not just steel. Copper. The war ran on copper. Every shell casing, every cartridge, every mile of telegraph wire, every field telephone, every ship's electrical system. It was all copper, and a huge share of it came out of one narrow stretch of southeastern Arizona, 7 miles from the Mexican border. Between 1914 and 1917, the price of copper roughly doubled. Phelps Dodge profits went vertical. The company was making more money in months than it had previously made in years, and the men actually digging that copper out of the ground were breathing rock dust that gave them silicosis, working under 2-man drills that killed them regularly, getting paid partly in company scrip they could only spend at the company store, and if they were Mexican, getting paid less than a white miner doing the same job in the same shaft on the same shift. That last detail matters more than it sounds, because the wage difference was not a loophole, it was policy. The Arizona copper industry called it the dual wage system. White American miners on one payroll, Mexican miners, and often Southern and Eastern European miners on another. Same danger, different money. The men underground knew it. Everybody in Bisbee knew it. And it had held for decades because every attempt to organize a union across those lines had collapsed. The Western Federation of Miners had, at various points, excluded Mexicans and Chinese entirely. The company knew that a divided workforce was a controllable workforce. Divide them by race, divide them by language, divide them by pay grade, and you never have to negotiate with all of them at once. There is one more piece of scale to understand before you can see what happened next. In 1917, Bisbee was producing enough copper on its own that it was sometimes described as the biggest copper producer on Earth. It was not a mining town in the folkloric sense of a few grizzled prospectors panning creek beds. It was an industrial complex. Whistles blew across the canyon in shifts. Ore moved on rails day and night. Trains left every day, loaded for the smelter at Douglas, 20 miles away, and from there for the ports and the eastern factories. The war effort in France was not an abstraction here. If Bisbee stopped, artillery shell production somewhere else in America would notice within weeks. Here is the other thing about Bisbee that has to land before anything else makes sense. Phelps Dodge did not just own the mine. It owned the town, the hospital, the library, the largest hotel, the Copper Queen, still standing today with English oak paneling and Tiffany glass, because Walter Douglas's father built it as a monument to himself, the only department store, the newspaper. It had built its own railroad, the El Paso and Southwestern, to haul copper out. Bisbee was not a town with a big employer. Bisbee was a corporation with a population. The man running that corporation was Walter S. Douglas. Douglas was Phelps Dodge's president. He lived in New York. He traveled to Bisbee in his private rail car. His father, James Douglas, had helped found the town in the first place. Walter grew up understanding it as family property, and by 1917 he had made a promise, repeated in newspapers of the day, and remembered by every historian who has written about him since. He intended to break every union in every mine in Arizona. Every one. Keep that promise in mind, because a week before what happened in Bisbee, Douglas ran what looks, in hindsight, exactly like a rehearsal. In Jerome, Arizona, about 200 miles north, another Phelps Dodge mine went on strike. Douglas told his superintendents to get the miners out of town. The local sheriff obliged. 100 men were arrested, 67 were loaded onto a train and dumped in Needles, California, and told not to come back. Almost nobody outside Arizona noticed. No federal official intervened. No court stopped it. It worked, and Douglas was paying attention, because the real problem was coming. The industrial workers of the world, the Wobblies, had spent months quietly organizing in Bisbee. The IWW was a genuinely radical union. Its constitution opened with the line that the working class and the employing class had nothing in common. But what made it terrifying to Phelps Dodge was not the ideology, it was the arithmetic. The Wobblies were organizing across ethnic lines that had always kept the workforce split: Mexican miners, Serbs, Finns, Irish, Croats, Italians, Cornish. They had formed Metal Mine Workers Union number 800, and by early summer of 1917 they had signed up over 1,000 men. On June 26th, they called a strike. About 3,000 miners walked out, 85% of the workforce. Every big operation in Bisbee, not just Phelps Dodge, was shut down. Their demands were almost boring. A $6 minimum daily wage, up 50 cents from what they were making. Get rid of the two-man drill that miners believed increased silicosis. End the physical examinations the company used as a blacklist. Stop tying wages to the daily fluctuations of the copper market. And pay Mexican workers the same as white workers for the same job. Read that list again. This is what a corporation later spent millions of dollars, an army of vigilantes, a national propaganda campaign, and a Supreme Court case trying to destroy. Not a revolution. A 50-cent raise, a safer drill, and equal pay. Douglas refused to negotiate a single item. And here is where you have to understand his real position. He did not want to negotiate. He wanted this strike. It was the excuse he had been waiting for. But the problem in front of him was still gigantic. 3,000 striking men in a town of 8,000 people. The federal government was not going to send in the army. President Wilson had already refused, twice. Douglas had personally pressured the state governor to request federal troops, and the White House had said no. Martial law was not on the table. The Espionage Act had just been signed on June 15th, days before the walkout, but even that only reached so far. Douglas needed a way to physically remove more than 1,000 men from an American city without doing anything a federal court would recognize as a crime. He found one, and it started with a story. The story was that the strikers were German agents. The United States had entered the war in April. Every newspaper was screaming about spies. Pancho Villa had raided Columbus, New Mexico, only 16 months earlier and burned part of the town. The Zimmermann telegram, in which Germany had secretly offered Mexico an alliance against the United States if it entered the war, was fresh in every reader's memory. Douglas and his allies fed the New York Times the line that the Bisbee strike was a plot financed by Berlin, coordinated with German agents operating out of Mexico, designed to cut off the copper flow to Allied armies in France. It was a lie, but it was a useful lie. When the army finally took a census of the deported men months later, they found fewer than 50 Germans out of more than 1,200. The largest group, by a wide margin, was Mexican. The second largest was British. The lie did not have to be true. It only had to travel faster than the truth. And in the summer of 1917, in a country 3 months into a war it had never really wanted to enter, any story about German saboteurs on the border was going to travel very fast indeed. Newspapers across the country picked it up. The Wobblies were foreign. The Wobblies were radical. The Wobblies opposed the war. Therefore, the Wobblies had to be German. The logic did not need to be tight. It only needed to be loud. Enter Harry Wheeler. Wheeler was the sheriff of Cochise County, former Arizona Ranger, veteran of the Spanish-American War. On paper, exactly the kind of straight-backed lawman you would put in a Western. In reality, by early July, Wheeler was in secret meetings with Douglas and with John Greenway, the general manager of the neighboring Calumet and Arizona Mining Company. There is a persistent allegation in the historical record that Wheeler was paid as much as $10,000 by the mines to break the strike. Historians have never fully proven the number. It is possible he acted out of genuine, if paranoid, patriotism, but the outcome speaks for itself. Whatever the price, Wheeler had become an extension of Phelps Dodge. He formalized it by creating two private paramilitary organizations dressed up in civic clothing: the Workmen's Loyalty League, the Citizens Protective League. Businessmen, foremen, company loyalists, shopkeepers who depended on Phelps Dodge payroll for their own income. They wore white armbands so they could recognize each other in the street. Wheeler quietly deputized them: 1,200 in Bisbee, another 1,000 in the neighboring town of Douglas. Roughly 1 out of every 8 residents of Bisbee was suddenly, on paper, an officer of the law. And on July 11th, Phelps Dodge executives handed Wheeler something that changes the whole nature of what happened next: a list, not a legal document, not an indictment, a pre-written corporate list of names: miners, union organizers, sympathizers, neighbors who had refused to cross the picket line, some men whose only offense was that they had not shown up for work that week, some men who had never been in a union in their lives, but who had spoken publicly against the strike being called illegal. Wheeler put out a proclamation the same day, printed in the Bisbee Daily Review, announcing that he had assembled a sheriff's posse of loyal Americans to arrest, in his words, strange men who have congregated here from other parts and sections. They had not congregated. Most of them lived there. Some had lived there for years. Some had been born there. That same night, company officials seized the Western Union Telegraph Office and shut down outgoing news. Associated Press dispatches were held. Phone lines were cut. The newspaper, which Phelps Dodge owned, printed an ominous morning headline warning women and children to keep off the streets. Whatever was about to happen in Bisbee was not going to reach the outside world in time to stop it. At 6:30 in the morning on July 12th, the siren at the Douglas smelter blared. That was the signal. Not for a fire, for a roundup. 2,200 armed men in white armbands fanned out through the town. They went door to door. No warrants. Husbands were pulled out of bed in front of their wives. Children were separated from fathers. Men were prodded into the street with rifle butts, some still in their nightclothes, some clutching hats they had grabbed on the way out. In one doorway, a wobbly named James Brew, who had said the night before that he would not be taken alive, shot a Phelps Dodge shift boss named Orson McRae dead and was killed himself in the return fire from McRae's companions. 2 dead, the only 2 deaths of the day. Everywhere else in Bisbee that morning, the guns did the talking without firing. Sheriff Wheeler personally oversaw the operation from a car with a belt-fed Marlin machine gun mounted on it. He drove up and down the streets like a general on a battlefield. And by 7:30 in the morning, he had 2,000 men marching in a slow, sun-bleached column 2 miles across town. The destination was Warren Ballpark, a baseball diamond, ringed by armed guards. In the July Arizona sun, no water, no food, no charge, no warrant. Just 2,000 American men penned inside a fence, watched by other men who worked for a corporation. This is where the word camp becomes literal. But if you were expecting the ballpark to be the punishment, you have already misread what Phelps Dodge was actually doing. The ballpark was not a prison, it was a sorting facility, because at the Diamond, the men were offered a deal. Put on a white armband, renounce the IWW, go back into the mine. About 700 of them accepted. That, from Douglas's perspective, was already a victory because it broke the strike numerically. The remaining 1,286 refused, and that refusal is what put them on the train. At 11 in the morning, 23 cattle cars pulled into the siding. They belonged to the El Paso and Southwestern Railroad, which is to say, they belonged to Phelps Dodge itself. The corporation was providing the transport for its own deportation. The men were forced into cars that were, according to survivors, ankle-deep in manure from the livestock that had ridden in them the week before. 186 armed guards climbed on. A machine gun went up on the roof of the train, and what became known as the Wobbly Special began a 16-hour crawl east into the desert, without food, without water, in the July heat, with the temperature inside the closed cars reaching well over 90 degrees. The plan was to unload the men at Columbus, New Mexico. Columbus was a U.S. Army post, Camp Furlong, still remembered today because it was the town Pancho Villa had raided the year before. The commander at Camp Furlong took one look at the train, understood exactly what he was being asked to accept, and refused. He told the crew that whatever authority they had in Arizona, they had none in New Mexico, and that if they did not turn the train around immediately, he would arrest every guard on it for kidnapping. The train backed up. It stopped at a place called Hermanas, a dirt siding in the middle of nothing. The guards uncoupled the cars, walked away, and left 1,200 men in the desert with no food, no water, and no shelter. It was 90 degrees. Some of them were already very sick. Local residents in the tiny nearby settlement brought what water and food they could carry, on foot, in the sun, until the well ran low. 2 days later, the U.S. Army finally sent troops to bring the men to Columbus, and when they got there, they were housed in tents. Tents that had been erected the year before to shelter Mexican refugees who had fled north to escape Pancho Villa's fight with the Mexican army. Let that sit for a moment. A camp originally built to protect people running from a war in Mexico was now housing people who had been driven out of America by a private corporation. The army fed them rations, told them they were technically free to leave, and waited. They stayed there for roughly 2 months. Some drifted north to find work. Some tried to walk home to Bisbee. When rations were finally cut off in September, the camp dissolved. But the men in the desert were only half the story, because while they were sitting in army tents in New Mexico, something even stranger was happening back in Bisbee. And this is what most people, even people who have heard of the Bisbee Deportation, do not know. Wheeler sealed the town. Guards were posted on every road in and out. Riflemen went up on the rooftops. And then Wheeler, working with the Citizens Protective League, began issuing something extraordinary. Passports. Locally printed passes. Nobody entered or left Bisbee without one. If you did not have a pass, you could not go to work. You could not visit family. You could not leave. Deputies interrogated arriving visitors about their politics before allowing them into town. Residents were pulled aside and asked about their views on the war, on unions, on their neighbors. For the next 4 months, an American town of 8,000 people was a controlled zone administered by a private corporation and its deputized paramilitary. That is not a metaphor. That is the documented arrangement. And inside that zone, Wheeler ran a court. Not a real court. A kangaroo court. Anybody suspected of Union sympathy was hauled in front of it. If the court decided against you, and it almost always did, you were given a set number of days to sell whatever property you owned to Phelps Dodge, at whatever price Phelps Dodge felt like offering, and get out. Some women whose husbands had escaped the initial roundup went in and told the Loyalty League that their men had died, because a dead husband was safer than a hiding one. This is the part of the story that most literally justifies calling what Phelps Dodge did a concentration camp. And it is worth pausing on the word, because it has changed meaning since 1917. In 1917, the phrase did not yet mean Auschwitz. It meant what the Spanish had done in Cuba in the 1890s, when General Weyler concentrated 300,000 civilians into camps to separate them from rebels. It meant what the British had done to Boer families in South Africa a few years later. It meant what governments were doing to civilian populations across the First World War. It meant a controlled zone, sealed by armed force, where a targeted population lived under the authority of the people who had rounded them up. That is exactly what Bisbee became, and it was not built by a government. It was built by a corporation. Eventually, and only eventually, the Arizona Attorney General ordered Wheeler to stop the passport system and the kangaroo court. But by then the Union was gone. The men were scattered. The families that remained had learned what happened to people who spoke. Now, if you were listening to this in 1917 and you believed in the American legal system, you would expect what happened next. The federal government would step in. There would be an investigation. Somebody, at least, would go to prison. President Woodrow Wilson did appoint an investigation. The Mediation Commission, led by a young lawyer named Felix Frankfurter, who would later sit on the Supreme Court. Frankfurter's report, published in November 1917, called what happened in Bisbee wholly illegal. Not merely wrong, not merely regrettable. Wholly illegal, in plain federal language. The report went further. It said the deportation had been a deliberate, coordinated act by the mining companies, that the sheriff had acted as their agent, and that the German plot story had been a fabrication with no factual basis. It was as strong a finding as a federal investigation could produce, short of a criminal indictment. In May 1918, the Justice Department followed up with exactly that. It indicted 21 Phelps Dodge executives, including Walter Douglas himself, along with dozens of vigilantes. 224 defendants in total. The charges were serious. The evidence was overwhelming. The witnesses were still alive. And this is the point in the story where the trap that had been quietly built underneath all of it finally snapped shut. In 1920, the case reached the Supreme Court. It is called United States versus Wheeler, and the court ruled 8-1 that the federal government had no authority to prosecute anyone for what happened in Bisbee. Kidnapping, the court said, was a state matter, not a federal one. It was Arizona's job to prosecute Arizonans, not Washington's. The federal indictments collapsed instantly. Arizona did try. Sort of. One of the deputies, a man named Harry Wooten, was put on trial in state court. His defense argued something they called the law of necessity, meaning that because the vigilantes had believed they were preventing a larger harm, they were justified. The jury acquitted him in 15 minutes. After that, the county attorney quietly dismissed the charges against every remaining defendant. All 224 of them walked. Not one conviction. Not for kidnapping. Not for false imprisonment. Not for anything. Wheeler himself was not even in the country by then. He had gone to France to fight in the war. He came home a decorated veteran. The wartime patriotism that had been used to justify the roundup now protected the man who had led it. He died in Bisbee in 1925, in his own bed, at 50. That is the reversal the whole story has been building toward. The mine owners had not just avoided the law. They had, with the Supreme Court's signature, established that the law did not reach them, and that principle sat there, quietly, waiting. In Bisbee itself, the immediate consequence was what Douglas had wanted from the start. Independent unionism in Arizona copper mining was finished for a generation. Phelps Dodge and the other companies replaced it with company unions, which is exactly what it sounds like. Unions run by the mining companies for the mining companies. Grievances handled internally. Wages set internally. Every question about the workplace answered inside the same building where the profits were counted. Wages stayed low. Silicosis kept killing men. The deported miners were blacklisted across the American West. Word traveled fast among mine operators, and a name on the Bisbee list closed doors from Butte, Montana, to the coalfields of West Virginia. Some of the deported men slipped back into Bisbee years later under false names, working the same mines that had once expelled them, quietly, not looking anybody in the eye. One family, the Hanhilas, ended up in the Minnesota iron mines before returning to Bisbee in 1920 under new identities, along with other renamed former deportees. Their small son, born the year of the deportation, was later remembered as the littlest striker. Others never came back at all. Their families waited years for men who never wrote, never called, and eventually stopped existing anywhere the town could find them. The Copper Queen mine kept running until 1975. When it finally closed, Bisbee's population fell from a peak of around 20,000 toward the roughly 5,000 who live there today. Phelps Dodge itself outlived everyone involved. Douglas died in 1946, wealthy and unindicted. Wheeler was buried in Bisbee at 50. Frankfurter went to the Supreme Court. In 2007, Phelps Dodge was absorbed by Freeport-McMoRan, one of the largest mining corporations in the world. The company that built a concentration camp in an American town in 1917 did not vanish. It just changed its letterhead. And Warren Ballpark, the diamond where 2,000 men stood in the sun, waiting to be sorted into those who would submit and those who would be shipped into the desert, is still there. It still hosts baseball games, amateur teams, summer leagues, kids in the stands eating peanuts. There is a small plaque now. For most of the 20th century, there was nothing. The residents of Bisbee called it, quietly, the cone of silence. Almost nobody talked about what had happened at the ballpark. Almost nobody wanted to. It was only after 2017, the 100th anniversary, that the town finally began publicly reenacting the events, walking the same streets, in period costume, as if trying to remember something they had spent a century agreeing not to. So here is the real answer to the question the opening of this story asked. How did a private American company do this? It did it by understanding, before almost anybody else understood, that in the United States the line between a corporation and a government could be dissolved with the right partners. Phelps Dodge did not need the Army. It had a sheriff. It did not need Congress. It had a wartime narrative. It did not need a legal system. It had the Supreme Court's silence and the machinery it built for a single week in July 1917, the list, the paramilitary, the sorting facility, the transportation, the sealed town, the passports, the kangaroo court worked exactly as designed and cost its architects nothing. The Bisbee Deportation remains the largest mass kidnapping in American labor history. It was planned and executed by a corporation. Not one person was ever punished for it. And the deepest thing to sit with is not really the cruelty of it, though it was cruel. It is the legal architecture. Because when the Supreme Court ruled in 1920 that Washington could not touch what happened at that ballpark, the court was not just closing a case. It was quietly answering a question that nobody had officially asked. It was defining, in the specific silence of what the federal government would not do, how much private power in America was allowed to have. The men who were loaded into those cattle cars never got that ruling reversed. The families that were told to sell their property to Phelps Dodge and get out never got compensated. The company kept mining copper. The country kept fighting the war. And the ballpark, that flat, dusty, ordinary American baseball diamond, went on hosting Sunday games as if nothing had ever happened there. Whether you think what Phelps Dodge did in Bisbee in 1917 was a one-time aberration produced by wartime panic, or whether you think it was the moment the country quietly wrote down what a big enough corporation was permitted to do to the people who worked for it, is a question the historical record does not fully answer. It only lays out the evidence. But the next time somebody tells you that an American company could never build its own concentration camp on American soil, you might mention a town called Bisbee, a sheriff named Wheeler, and a baseball park that is still standing.